Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I've long been a fan of the Red River Basin Commission and its collaborative approach across sectors and boundaries, state and national among them, of course, and so I'm honored to be here. I do want to acknowledge these are anxious and troubling times and commend us all for forging ahead to do our part in keeping the corners of our worlds as steady as possible. And so I don't want to startle anyone with the bright lights right off, and I will start with the bad news, much of which you are all very well aware, but allow me to package it for my purposes. I'll also acknowledge up front now that I do not sway here too much from my US upper Midwestern biases and examples, using acres rather than hectares and things like that. So bear with me. So we are losing a lot of things, and for good reason. It feels like these losses are happening at an accelerating pace. Lives, health, nutrition, our well-being, weather stability, natural resource assets like soil, land, water quality, and the control of water quantity and flow. Certainly, of course, the coronavirus pandemic continues to surge, especially in the US, taking lives far beyond the average loss due to disease. These numbers are people, and we are all feeling their losses in very personal ways. And I'll share that just updating this slide over the past couple of weeks has brought it home to me even more, and it's just heartbreaking. The pandemic has brought into relief the fragility of many of our systems, the US food system being one. Leah Douglas with the Food and Environment Reporting Network has been tracking infections and deaths, mostly in meatpacking, but also other food processing and with farm workers since the beginning of the pandemic. She tweeted on January 5th that as of January 15th, there are 82,000 infections, and I'm sure now at this point, 360 have died. It wasn't until this tweet that I realized what she shared here, which was less than 10 states are releasing this data to her. So we know the numbers are bigger. And she says, even with the information she has, that these are growing faster across the months. The increasing stress from loss of biodiversity and wildlife habitat due to human-centered development leads to cross-species diseases and new viruses in humans. We know that the current pandemic has animal origins, as do the SARS outbreaks over the last 2 decades. A year ago, the New York Times ran an opinion piece by David Quammen, author of Spillover. He wrote, "We disrupt ecosystems and we shake viruses loose from their natural hosts. When that happens, they need a new host. Often we are it." Nutrition. We like to say we are what we eat. Well, we eat what we grow. And I would say we're losing the conception of what is good nutrition. You know, the majority of millions of acres, especially in the US Midwest, are a few commodity crops, which continue to be inputs for more and new highly processed items with low to no nutritional value. This is just one example, but we could probably do this in every state and province, right? Iowa, corn and soybean today, about 65% of its land. But less than a century ago, a commercial center for things like grapes, apples, onions, sweet corn. Predictable weather. I would say we've lost predictable weather, and that comes from hearing from some very expert meteorologists that say we can't really predict anymore. We know that our greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, though we had a bit of a dip globally because of less human activity over the last year. Agriculture, with all the analyses over the last couple of decades, kind of holds steady at a 10% contribution to those emissions across North America. Global warming is at about 1 degree Celsius, likely, if we keep moving in this direction, to crest 1.5 Celsius, possibly even within this decade. And the reports about what the world will look like at 1.5 degrees Celsius is probably not a world we want to live in. The concomitant impacts could be a long list, but I'm listing here polar cap melt-offs, ocean warming, acidification rising. There's a variety of health impacts that are exacerbated or new because of climate conditions. Severe weather events are leading, of course, to loss of life and property, habitats, ecosystems, and soil. So to soil, there's a new Union of Concerned Scientists report, very well done, called Eroding the Future, that came out last month. And it was full of so many good quotes that I'm including quite a few of them here. Every year, US croplands lose at least twice as much soil to erosion as the Great Plains did at the peak of the Dust Bowl. If we continue as we are, this report tells us we'll lose another ½ inch or 28 billion tons in the US in 15 years. And by 2100, 3 inches or nearly 150 billion tons of soil. So to quote, given that the natural formation of an inch of soil takes a century or longer, the loss by 2100 equals at least 300 years worth of naturally formed soil. And of course, we know that climate change is exacerbating and accelerating these rates of loss. So 3 more quotes. The demise of many early civilizations have been attributed to the neglect of soil, yet untenable rates of erosion persist around the world. The FAO of the United Nations has warned that erosion rates are so high that they threaten the future of farming as we know it. And I want to highlight this last one. In balanced ecosystems where plants above ground and roots below ground protect soil year-round, soil erodes at roughly the same rate as it is formed. And so if we steward working lands in a way that mimics balanced ecosystems, we not only reduce soil loss, but we also create an environment for soil formation on lands producing goods at the same time. I had to pull their graph as well. You know, by the mid-'80s, we understood what was happening, put lots of programs into place, but we, for a variety of reasons, and it's not just those programs' faults, but we're just seeing this incredible increase. I mean, this graph is a slap in the face. I do want to pull out this pasture erosion. This little layer on the top represents erosion from pasture lands. So think of that as a proxy for an agriculture that keeps plant materials and roots in the ground all year round. If we were to reduce soil erosion at that level, or even half of that cumulative erosion in 2015, think of what a different world we'd be living in. So soil loss, of course, is, as you all know, loss of organic matter, biodiversity, water quality, water holding capacity and storage. Infrastructure is getting bombarded, not only by winds and water, but the particulate matter in the soils that it's carrying with them. We lose land values and, of course, productivity off of farmland. This bottom photograph I took down the road from me in 2019. I would call it a bare cornfield. Planted as we plant it, probably about a month old. And when the rains came, you know, it was not a fight. It was the water handily pulled off the soil from those fields, and they ran over roads and landed in our ditches. So land, we are using more land. We are losing land. Not only are we stripping the biodiversity and basic ecological attributes from our agricultural landscapes, but our agriculture is chewing up more natural spaces. So the World Wildlife Fund's annual Plowprint report tracks grassland loss across the Great Plains. 4 football fields every minute, according to their analysis, is lost across North America to agricultural conversion from 2014 to 2018. In 2018 alone, we lost over 500,000 acres. So this is an interactive map that they offer. I zoomed in as best I could to the Red River Basin. Of course, the resolution isn't all that great, but you'll get the idea. So the brown area is what they call their cumulative plowprint, really whatever was in agriculture as of 2012. So we layer on top of that the 2012 and to 2019 expansion. And you see all of these points of light: corn, wheat, soy, mostly canola, possibly other grains, though I doubt you can really see it on this resolution. So the land lights up. You know, again, we are using more land, increasing the footprint for the type of agriculture that is extractive and destructive in ways, and now at levels that we can hardly any longer absorb. We must produce what we need differently, and by doing so, we can also reap additional benefits like more nutritious inputs and foods, as well as slowing and stopping these losses that we've talked about. So water quality, if I go to the river basin that I work in, the Upper Mississippi River Basin, the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force in 2008 created its own action plan. It called for a 45% nutrient reduction by 2035. the upper Mississippi River Basin states were asked to develop nutrient reduction strategies, which they created and were mostly approved between 2013 and 2014. I know you're hearing from Dave Wall later this morning from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. You know, there has been progress. These are savvy strategies done expertly, but we won't get there in time. They unfortunately are too long of a view, you know, not without and without kind of the implementation supports and policy supports we need. We can't make this progress. Farmers can't make this progress without help growing in a different way. We can't achieve the nutrient reduction goals with millions and millions of acres in annual row crop, even using lots of currently accepted best management practices on many, many acres. Water infiltration. So if the soils can't hold or store as much water as they possibly could, it's going to contribute to flooding, as you know better than I do. I pulled a few images here from the Red River Flooding Facebook page. This is Grand Forks last April, and the extent of the flood in the map view. This is the April before, I-29 corridor. I did not make this meme. I'm bouncing it from this Facebook page, but you know, maybe you'll catch a break in 2021. Will flooding be canceled due to coronavirus? I guess we can only hope. So in 2019, the Food and Land Use Coalition released a report about growing better that included an analysis comparing the market value of the global food system with the external costs of that same system. Costs that involve poor health and disease, pollution, greenhouse gases, food loss, rural welfare issues, and so on. And the price tag, the cost of doing business of a $10 trillion market is $12 trillion, according to their analyses. So not a sound financial picture. For all we are doing to improve the impacts of ag, and I know that many of you are working very hard on worthy programs, we just aren't turning the tide. We are losing ground in every sense of the phrase. So what's the alternative? There's a generation or two of thinking, at the very least, around dissolving the reductive frameworks that lead us to separate agriculture from the natural world with its benefits and ecosystem services. Intensive monocropped annual agriculture causes losses that we just covered in part. And we need to embrace the idea that we can have it all: production of food, feed, fiber, and fuel, as well as ecosystem services, nurtured resources like soil formation, wildlife habitat, and the like. This illustration is from a piece that came out over 15 years ago now, but it's a great illustration that you've probably seen and we all use over and over again. So the left side, you know, taking a look at the natural ecosystem, provides all these services, some of the things we've been talking about, you know, in addition to things like forest production and, well, I've kind of mentioned all these others, air quality regulation. In the center is a choice around intensive cropland, where we get a lot of crop and sometimes singular crops out of a lot of acres, but we lose the ability for that land to provide ecosystem services. And I'll say we also strip the possibility, because of the magnitude of how much we put into crop production, of the ability of the other lands to provide the natural ecosystem services that we need. So on the right side, you know, is what I call extensive CLC, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea of being able to produce crop as well as have all of these ecosystem services. That's why GLBW was created. So we were created in 2004 by representatives of land-grant universities and ag and environmental organizations across the upper Midwest. The idea from the beginning was a systems level positioning to increase the broad support for perenniality in agriculture, working with a number of partners on a number of different kind of systems levers. Our home base is at the University of Minnesota, St. Paul, in the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Ag. I'm beaming in from Southeast Minnesota. I live in Rochester now. Our focus is, again, on this upper Mississippi River Basin. So we have partners in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois. Missouri, our prime partners there are working on agroforestry. And in Louisiana, we have key partners that actually do the hypoxia cruise every year and go out and measure the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So we really work with a network of partners focused on landscape scale change and systems level change. So working with partners that are engaged in research, developing education, engagement, outreach, capacity and opportunities, trying to shape policy to support this kind of ag, and building profitable markets is an incredibly important part of the work that we have done historically, but there are more now partners working in that part of the systems change that is really about, creating a pull for these kinds of new crops and systems on to the landscape. So our focus is kind of, we put a umbrella around all of this, and our work is around changing the narrative of what's possible in agriculture. So continuous living cover is what we call, I guess you could also say, perenniality in agriculture. So the idea is continuous living cover of live plants on the ground, roots in the ground year round, to get us those ecosystem services and also make our lands more productive. So we work in 5 signature strategies. This is just how we organize our work, but gives you an example of the kinds of systems we're talking about. Agroforestry, what I call the perennials, forage, grains, biomass, rotations. So how do we stack and rotate, certainly annual crops, hopefully cash cover crops, and then those winter annuals. There's some new annuals coming on, but winter annuals, shoulder season kinds of productive capacity that could give you on a farmscape, a singular farmscape, a perenniality across the year. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did a piece on land, and of course they say, well, yeah, land is a critical, resource. And but what I want to point out is that they say the land that we are already using could feed the world in a changing climate and provide biomass for renewable energy, and I would say provide agroforestry and provide perennial biomass, and could provide perennial grains and the like. So we could do all this on land, and we have some land to work with. So from the 2017 Census of Ag, I just took the top 3 crops, corn, soybean, and wheat, and took a look and just totaled those up, right? So we have about 17 million acres in Minnesota, North Dakota of corn, soybean, and wheat. That ends up being about 36.7% of the land in the state. In Iowa and Illinois, it's about 23 million acres, mostly of corn and soybean, topping out in Iowa at 65% of the land in the state. So what if 5 to 10 to 25% of these lands were continuous living cover, providing products and livelihoods for farms and farmers? The Iowa STRIPS project, short for, are you ready? Science-based trials of row crop integrated with prairies, has shown that strips of native prairie plants on just 10% of corn and soybean fields result in significant environmental and production side benefits. So imagine the landscape health and public health improvements that we could have. This picture again is down the road for me, the spring of 2019. And the second picture is a very different kind of spring scene. So planting corn into a bed of mixed cover crops. Yeah, it's messy, and we need to shift the way we appreciate working landscapes. Messy is good. Messy saves the soil. Messy holds water and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. This picture does highlight cover crops, and I want to talk about those for a moment. So cover crops are a gateway to understanding and implementing CLC, but they do not necessarily produce a harvestable commodity. By contrast, CLC agriculture is based on using commodity producing crops to provide a wide range of benefits. Some crops for CLC agriculture, such as perennial grain crops and winter oilseeds, are new, and other CLC systems are based on redesigning the production of existing crops, like alfalfa as a protein source, or management intensive grasslands for meat and dairy production. CLC agriculture is designed to build on the strengths of our current agriculture. Rather than taking row crop land out of production, CLC ag augments current production systems. So let's take a breath, and I'm going to get a drink of water. And take in this guy, the Western meadowlark. And while you're feasting your eyes on this award-winning photograph, I'll return to that World Wildlife Fund plow print report. The latest analysis did see increases in perennial cover, things like alfalfa and hayland. The report said restored perennial habitat is preferable to plowed ground because it offers improved ecosystem function, such as water infiltration and storage, Many grassland birds, pollinators, and mammals are able to survive in restored perennial habitat, which provides critical food and shelter. So I'll say again, this on working lands. Like we can do things on working lands and provide this kind of habitat. There's a new narrative group that's grown out of the GLBW ecosystem, I guess you could call it, called Partnering for Perennials. These are partners we worked with for a number of years. It's focused on developing evidence-based communication products targeted mostly at policymakers and funders. So the next few slides are out of the thinking of this group. So we could think about an old taxonomy of crop options, right? The umbrella of agriculture, the agronomic crops that we're familiar with, grain crops and forage crops, which are good. And then this world of horticultural crops that kind of get sidelined, the fruits and vegetables, especially in the Midwest, some tree crops that we know about. So if we think about a new taxonomy of crop options, we have this big umbrella of agriculture. We're going to have those annuals. No one's saying they should go away, but start thinking about, instead of a kind of a niche world of other perennials, perennial grains and forages, tree crops, new and improved, we need to start seeing perennials. And we can think about a perennial portfolio. We have things now, perennial forages. We could improve markets for those, the ability for farmers to engage in perennial forages, but we're ready now, and we could boost those acres. We have current tree crops. We could do a lot more right now. We could also do some major investment in R&D. There are early prototypes of perennial grain. So some of you may have heard about Kernza, which is a perennialized intermediate wheatgrass. Most of the genetics research is out of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and the University of Minnesota. Kernza is the name of the seed or the kernel itself, registered by the Land Institute, although the use of Kernza as the name for the plant is becoming more widespread. The first variety was released by the University of Minnesota in August of 2019, called Minnesota Clearwater. And about 1,000 acres are in production now, mostly in the Midwest states of the US. Other perennial research involves sunflower, flax, sorghum, and rice, just to name a few. So what does this all mean? We could do this at scale. This can change our landscape in a completely different way, and not just think about it as niche markets. We can do forages at large scales, tree crops much more than we're doing, and those perennial grains, and not just specialty foods, but creating or developing new supply of staple food and staple inputs. So if we transition this taxonomy to the landscape, here's a visualization. Annual grain crops that we recognize on the left side. You know, there's some trees, probably buffers, but maybe there's some agroforestry, and perennial forages play a minor role. So we start putting onto the landscape perennial grains for staple food production, improve those tree crops and increase our acreage of agroforestry, reintegrate livestock with perennial forages and silver pasture as well. And alley cropping arrangements provide a number of opportunities. And of course, we will have those remaining annual crops. So in order to resource up this work, some are devising new financial portfolios and transactional instruments to encourage impact investing in transitioning agricultural systems. This work is aimed at a variety of investor types, including food and ag corporate partners themselves, who need to protect and sustain their own supply chains and develop new products. They also need to answer consumers' demands for regenerative or green products that have evidence to back up these claims of sustainability, like sustainable production, waste minimization, and climate change mitigation. And I will say these firms are very honest about this and authentic, that they need to be able to make these claims and have the evidence. General Mills has kind of been in the the sandbox with Kernza for a number of years. They've been a market partner in developing that new crop. Here is a portfolio of benefits or a menu of options to interest investors. This includes many of the things I touched on earlier, things we are losing. I love that this is based on a US government fact sheet about soil health. What a return on investment by treating our land and our soil well. So things like improved yield stability and sustainable livelihoods, reduction in disease and pests. GLBW is currently working with an organization called Ecotone to make an impact investing case for continuous living cover. The first effort that we're focusing on is developing monetized pathways and a sustainable social return on investment figure for perennial forage systems as a proxy for a more generalizable case for CLC. We've had over 30 partners participating, providing input and perspectives and references. I do want to share Ecotone's purpose statement reads, "We believe a new era of informed impact investing has the potential to fundamentally change how and how much capital is mobilized to solve social and environmental challenges." This I just got yesterday. So this is a draft of our visualization of our SROI of perennial forage. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but our hope is that partners will be able to use the broader brochure. This is about a quarter of it for their own outreach purposes and fundraising. But we're very excited about this. It was great to see this yesterday. Again, this is estimated return for perennial forage, and we have some generalized CLC numbers in another part of this brochure. So policy levers. Policy is an important avenue for the legitimate redirection of public dollars for these public goods. Things like research and development, of CLC crops, of course, enterprise development and innovative financing. How do we develop the small businesses that we need along the way in addition to farmers? Targeted technical assistance is a gap we're actually involved in addressing right now. We could spend an afternoon talking about modifying the current subsidy, insurance, and conservation programs to prioritize CLC agriculture. We are also working on that a bit. We have a cohort across the upper Midwest states looking at ways to prioritize cost share funding for CLC in NRCS practices. And then, advancing programs that pay farmers for early adoption and implementation. We have to have some gap funding to allow farmers to transition. And there's a world of consideration and developing other instruments to provide environmental benefits to pay farmers for the environmental benefits of producing a CLC agriculture. We could also centralize CLC much more in drinking water protection initiatives. We're doing some of that in Minnesota. There are a number of sites, and that's actually was some of the inspiration of calling that Kernza release Minnesota Clearwater. So an example of policy support for public dollars at work. In the US, we are seeing increased investment of public funding through the USDA. I think it could be a bit more. These are $10 million projects for 5 years. But a drop in the bucket when you think about $146 billion a year for the USDA, but it's a start. There's a new section for Sustainable Ag Systems, SAS, that's been added to its Collaborative Agricultural Projects, or CAPS. I'm just explaining that so you understand these names. GLBW is involved in 2 of these. Grassland 2.0 is a project funded in the first cycle of SAS CAP grants 2 years ago. The project team is engaging established grazing networks of practitioners and producers to create local scenarios or plans to increase perennial forage and grazing and encourage the development of supportive policies and markets. Knitted together, these will form a regional agroecological plan to transform, we hope, a significant number of acres to perennial grassland. The Kernza CAP brings a number of research partners and collaborators together as well to move to the next level, all of the moving parts in developing and rolling out a new crop. This is about that perennial intermediate wheatgrass, Kernza, that I mentioned earlier. Things like improving the genetics and agronomics, understanding environmental impacts and benefits, facilitating adoption, assisting producer associations, developing supply chains, creating educational curriculum and extension tools, and engaging policy. It's a big lift, but that's the way that we start to develop these and design these systems to change our landscape. So bear with me as I shift gears a bit. I've been thinking a lot lately about edges as places of energy and inertia, in a most positive sense, places of creativity and innovation, often spurred by some strong force. We can think about being on the edge of our seats with anticipation or anxiety, at the edge of a new year politically in the US with a new administration, anxiety especially in the light of the events of the last few weeks. We are certainly all on edge as we continue to wage battle personally and collectively against the latest coronavirus. And although the struggle has dimmed a bit in the headlines, we know now more than ever is beyond time for us to facilitate a sharing and shifting of power, place, access, and leadership to our Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other community members and partners. In ecology, edges are called ecotones, transitional areas between biological communities. So let us broaden that to think about transitional spaces of co-creating a more perennial agriculture in tandem necessarily with a more equitable and just human culture. Agriculture is socio-cultural as well as biophysical. In 2019, GLBW invited Aubrey Street Krug, the director of Ecosphere Studies at the Land Institute, to speak at our conference. After a really quite moving presentation on the care work of agriculture, she asked the audience, if the ecological future of agriculture is to become perennial and diverse, what is required of humans in social terms? She and Omar Tesdal just published an online open access piece on these ideas. And they identified, of course, that the destruction of the past is present still and plagues us. Native populations replaced by settler populations, native perennial foodways and plant communities replaced by annual plow-based agriculture. They leave us with a premise. A social perennial vision for grain agriculture recognizes how food systems that are based upon relationships of domination could transform to feature more mutually beneficial relationships between peoples, plants, and the planet. So if we embrace the idea that diversity is good in natural systems, which is really quite serving, and that's just fine, it isn't a big leap to see the same for social systems. We've all heard before that there's quote unquote culture in agriculture. And so in agricultural work, we must also use our influence, energy, and creativity to deepen our cultural diversity. GLBW, as many last year, shifted, and the work of anti-racism and economic equality, more diverse representation in our work, is no longer optional. It is now, and actually has been all along, mandatory for fostering the kind of agricultural systems we want to see in the future. When the pandemic hit, and it was obvious we were not going to be using all that travel budget we had for us and our partners, we offered some of this funding to graduate students to write about how their CLC research relates broadly to the world they want to see. The response across institutions and perspectives has been so inspiring. These students are the future of agriculture, and just from the content of their statements, I, for one, will happily follow their lead. I'm going to spotlight 3 of these students next, and I'll introduce the student, but let you read on your own the excerpts from their pieces. Heidi Wright Meier, from your area, Crookston, did her undergrad at Crookston, continues there as a soil researcher and as a master's student at the U of M, Twin Cities. Daniel Hayden, PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Britt Moore, PhD student at Iowa State University. I invite you to take a look at the rest of these statements. They're on our website, and we're continuing to highlight them in our newsletters, which come out every other week is our new plan, and we're doing a pretty good job of that. So the other thing I want to mention about these is, we really said, hey, what are you thinking about in this time? We certainly were in the midst of the pandemic, and some of them, most of them, finished their writings after the George Floyd murder, and the and kind of the upheaval that came after that. So we called out a number of things. What do you think about leadership, your communities? We did name race and equity, but nearly every one of these statements mentioned something about equity and broadening our base of agriculture expertise and perspective. So in terms of other narrative building projects, I just wanted to mention we are doing some CLC farmer profiles, which is new for us, and those are coming out soon. We are also in the midst of developing a white paper, and we're thinking more and more about how do we complement the work of Partnering for Perennials and others that are focused on policymakers and funders. So we plan to design a more journalistic or broad readership piece on the resiliency and risk mitigation of CLC systems. We're hoping, similar to our Ecotone project, that this also is a menu of options that can be used by partners. So maybe, someone could pull out a quote or some kind of framing for a letter to the editor in a newspaper or their own newsletters and other outreach pieces. We also have tried our hand at an infographic, and we're hoping to do more of these. We have a really active Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group that is comprised of a number of experts across the upper Midwest states that are working in agencies and extension around forage and grazing. They come together, help each other out across state lines, and try to fill in the gaps. They've long been talking about how do we start conversations with local government around this idea that the farmland around your community can make a difference to the impact and the destruction that you're experiencing in terms of built infrastructure. So this is really a conversation piece. I'm kind of zoomed in here, but you can find this infographic as well on our website. I'm not going to go into all of this, so I'm just leaving this more as a slide of reference, other CLC points of light. I'll say just a quick thing. There's a lot happening still at the Academy. There's a new Illinois Regenerative Agriculture Initiative. I mentioned the Iowa Strips Project. You've heard from Don Weiss in the past, I believe this body has, around the Forever Green Initiative. And there's a new partnership now forming, another collaborative piece. So we're seeing a lot of more collaboration and across sector. And how do we really increase and scale up the commercialization opportunities and building these markets for consumers and for these new kinds of crops. I will pull out also that Practical Farmers of Iowa has just been doing an incredible job working with major supply chain partners where they're actually creating direct transactions with farmers to grow cover crops. And they just released an announcement of a new grant for growing small grains. Ecosystem service markets, we could spend another afternoon on that. I mentioned those briefly, but I think you get the idea. But there is continued interest, and there's continued interest with the new administration in the US around building those kinds of markets that pay farmers for the public good that they provide by a different kind of agriculture that can provide those ecosystem services. So one more slide from the IPCC. Every bit of warming matters, every year matters, every choice matters. I would add every acre matters and every person matters. And I'll leave you with this thought. Let's work our working lands like our life depends on it, because it does. Thanks for your time.